Hi everyone, I'm Melissa Landrum. I'm the team lead for the Clin Var database at the National Center for Biotechnology Information within the National Library of Medicine at the NIH. Today I'm going to give you an overview of Clin Var, then we'll talk more specifically about how to use the database, and then we'll talk about how you can share your own data through Clin Var. Clin Var is NCBI's archive of interpretations of variants relative to conditions. The data you see in Clin Var are considered to be variant level interpretations. So these are general interpretations of a variant and its significance for a disease or drug response, but not specific to an individual case or patient. A quick note on terminology. There are several different words that you might see in this presentation today or on the Clin Var website. You might see assertion, clinical significance, interpretation, classification. They all refer to the same concept of a variant level interpretation rather than an interpretation for a specific patient. All of the data in Clin Var is fully public and available for anyone to use. The database is driven by submissions of interpretations from many different organizations, and it's supported by curation from NCBI staff, but it's important to note that our staff are not curating the interpretations. We don't try and determine if an interpretation that is submitted to us is correct, and we don't try to resolve conflicts when they occur. Clin Var has really become a global database. Today we have more than 1.3 million submitted records that have been submitted by more than 1,800 organizations from 80 countries across the world. You can see the representation across the globe does vary a bit from region to region, and that's one reason I'm delighted to talk with this group today. We would love to see improved representation of data in Clin Var from the African genetics community. Clin Var has been around since 2013, and you can see we've experienced pretty steady growth over these last 7 or 8 years. As I mentioned previously, today we have 1.3 million submitted records, and that represents about 854,000 unique variants. We always have more submitted records in the database than unique variants because some variants have been submitted to us by more than one organization. Each record in Clin Var brings together these 4 domains of information that are important for variant classification. So first, of course, is a description of the variant itself, the condition, an interpretation of how that variant relates to the condition, and then the evidence, which in Clin Var is structured as observations of that variant. And here are some of the fields associated with observations. We also maintain connections to databases with related information like dbSNP or PubMed, and also to groups that provide standards that we use like ACMG and sequence ontology. The scope of data in Clin Var is pretty broad. Variants in Clin Var can be anywhere in the genome, in any gene, extragenic, or spanning multiple genes. It can be any type or size of variation, so the data ranges from single nucleotide variants and small insertions or deletions up to large copy number variants. And the interpretation can be for a single variant or a combination of variants. Most data in Clin Var are interpretations of single variants, so the interpretation of a single nucleotide variant or a single copy number variant. Occasionally, it's important to interpret 2 or more variants together as a haplotype or a genotype, but this is unusual within the database. For conditions in Clin Var, variants can be interpreted for diseases, for phenotypes or clinical features, or for drug responses. Because of drug responses, we use this more generic word condition rather than always referring to a variant-disease relationship. Variants in Clin Var may be interpreted for a single condition or a combination. Most variants are interpreted for a single disease or drug response. Combinations of conditions typically occur for variants that are interpreted for a novel disease that hasn't been named yet, but is described by a cluster of phenotypes or clinical features. The interpretations that you see in Clin Var range from interpretations of pathogenicity for Mendelian diseases, variants that are interpreted for their relationship to cancer, and pharmacogenomic variants that are interpreted for their response to a drug. I mentioned to you earlier that ClinVar is driven by submissions of data, and we also add value to the data that's submitted to us. The main way we do that is simply to archive the submitted data. So each submitted record is assigned an accession number, beginning with the prefix SCV, and that accession number also gets a version number. We increment the version number every time there's a change to the submitted record, and that allows us to maintain a history of changes to those submitted records over time. We also standardize and validate the data that's submitted to us wherever we can. Wherever there's a data standard that we can use, so things like HGS expressions for variant descriptions or HPO IDs for phenotypes, we try to use those. And whenever we can validate data, we try to do that as well, particularly for descriptions of the variant so that we can be sure of what variant has been interpreted. More information about the data standards that we use and the validations that we perform are available on the website. Another way that we add value is to aggregate the data that's submitted to us so that you can make connections across different submissions. And we aggregate the data in two ways. So first, we aggregate submissions that are for the same variant. We aggregate these into a record with a VCV accession number. We also aggregate submissions that are for the same variant and disease pair. These get aggregated into a record with an RCV accession number. And I can illustrate that a little better on the next slide. So let's say that we are interested in this short deletion. And you can imagine that someone may submit their interpretation of this variant to ClinVar. This is their SCV accession number for their submission. And we might get a few more submissions for this same variant over time. Each of these is a different submitted record from a different organization. Now, because we in ClinVar can tell all of these records are for the same variant, we can aggregate those into a variant record with this VCV accession number. If you look more closely at these submissions, you might notice that the first three were interpreted for breast ovarian cancer familial 1, and one of them was interpreted for a slightly more generic term, hereditary cancer predisposing syndrome. So we also aggregate the records by the variant and disease pair. So the three submissions that were interpreted for breast ovarian cancer familial 1 are aggregated into one RCV record, and the submission that interpreted the variant for hereditary cancer predisposing syndrome is aggregated into a separate RCV record because it's for a different variation disease pair. So in some cases, it's really useful to be able to separate the data out by disease, but in a case like this, it might not be. So sometimes it's really better to see all the data for a variant regardless of the disease. In this presentation, we're really going to focus on these variation records, the VCV records, and this is also what you see by default when you search for data in ClinVar. So that's what we're going to shift our focus to next, is using ClinVar data. There are three main ways to access data in ClinVar. You can download data from our FTP site, you can access it programmatically using the eUtilities APIs, and you can also search for data on the website. I'm guessing that most of the audience members today primarily will use the website, but in case there are some bioinformaticians in the group, or in case you have team members who work in bioinformatics that you'd like to pass some information along to, I'm going to briefly mention our information that's available by FTP and eUtilities. So on our FTP site, you can download the comprehensive data set from ClinVar in our XML files. These are really the only files available that have the comprehensive data set. The files are available in two varieties. So the file labeled ClinVar Full Release represents the RCV records. So these are the records that are aggregated by the variant disease pairs. And the XML file that's titled ClinVar Variation Release represents the VCV records. So these are the aggregate records based on the variant aggregation. We also have ClinVar data available in VCF format. The VCF files are very convenient to use. There's lots of tools that handle VCF files, but these files are not comprehensive in two ways. So VCF file is a fairly flat format, so it really only contains summary data and not all of the rich data and relationships that we can represent more easily in XML. The VCF file also is limited to variants with a precise location on the genome. So any variant that has a more imprecise or fuzzy location, like a copy number variant that's only defined by the location of probes on a microarray, an exon deletion where it's not exactly certain where the breakpoint is in the exons, these kinds of imprecise location variants are not found in the VCF file. So this is not a comprehensive file. We also have several tab delimited files that provide summary data of various slices. I've shown three of the most popular files here. One file is focused on giving summary level information per variant. This file gives summary level information per submitted record. And then we also have a file that provides summary information per gene. All these files are available on our FTP site, and there's also README files available with more information. Clin Var data can also be accessed programmatically using e-utilities, which are a set of APIs provided by NCBI for access to data in the Entrez databases. So you can use e-utilities either using web services or at the command line using Entrez Direct. And these are each links to more information about how to use e-utilities in both ways. So for ClinVar, we have 4 of the e-utilities functions available. eSearch lets you search ClinVar for records of interest. So for example, you can search for a gene symbol or a disease and get back all of the IDs for records that match your search term. You can then use those IDs to use eSummary to get back a summary of each record of interest, or use eFetch to get the full record for each of those results. E-Link lets you make connections between those records of interest in ClinVar and data that may be available in other Entrez databases like PubMed. More information about how to use e-utilities and ClinVar is available on our website also. So now we're going to switch and spend most of our time talking about using ClinVar data on the web. So this is ClinVar's homepage. I imagine most of you are somewhat familiar with this page. One thing that I do want to draw your attention to is this navigation bar that's near the top. This has links to lots of information about ClinVar. Many of the links that I've included in the presentation today are available through this navigation bar. So I encourage you to explore the information that you find here. You'll find lots of useful information. And of course, if you want to get started looking at ClinVar data on our website, you really just want to start in the search box here by typing in something of interest to you. You can put anything into the search bar, but there's a few suggestions that I have for really useful search terms. So one thing to note is that some queries are more specific than others, and it kind of depends on what you're looking for as to which would be the best search term for you. So if you're looking for a specific variant, probably the best kind of search term is an HGVS expression. So a full HGVS expression using accession.version, colon, and the C dot or whatever change is really the most specific term you can use. You can also search on partial HGVS expressions like just a C dot or just a P dot. These are a little less specific because there may be a variant in more than one gene that can be described like this. Searching ClinVar with RS numbers is a good thing to do. RS numbers are fairly specific, but they are not allele specific. So it's important to remember that the RS numbers in dbSNP represent a kind of variation at a location. So they always represent the reference allele and one or more alternate alleles. And we may have both the reference and the alternate or more than one alternate allele in ClinVar. So you may get back more than one result if you search ClinVar with an RS number. Protein change descriptions like V600E are pretty good search terms. Again, these are not as specific as a full HGVS expression because there may be a variant in more than one gene or protein that you can describe like this. Gene symbols are less specific search terms, but they are useful if what you want to find are all of the variants in ClinVar for a specific gene. It's also useful to combine a gene symbol with one of these less specific search terms, like you could add the gene symbol BRAF to V600E and make a more specific query. You could also add a gene symbol to a C dot or a P dot and make a more specific query. One thing I will note is that it is important to use the official gene symbol from HGNC when you're searching ClinVar, not any previous or unofficial symbols. And then finally, you can also search ClinVar using a disease or a phenotype term. Again, this is a less specific type of search term, but if that's what you're looking for, is to cast a broad net and look for all variants that have been reported to ClinVar for a certain disease or phenotype, that can be a good way to do it. We have more information about searching on our website. We also have a very nice YouTube video. It's about a 5-minute video that gives you these tips and a bit more. And also note that we do have an option in our search bar for advanced search. This is a query builder that lets you build a more specific search using specific fields in the database. So I'm not going to that option today, but it is available online if you're interested in exploring that yourself. So when you do a search in ClinVar, if you get a single result, we take you directly to that page. If you get more than one result, we present those results to you as a table like the one shown here. So here I did a search for the LDLR gene, and I got about 3,000 results. We present the results as this table, which is sorted in the order along the chromosome. But there are some options here at the top of the page where you can change away from the tabular format. You can change how many records are shown per page, and you can also change the sort order. I got about 3,000 results here, and that sometimes that may be what you want, and sometimes you may want to narrow down your results a bit more. So we have a set of filters on the left here that let you choose a subset of your search results. So here I've selected filters so that I'm only getting variants that have been reported to be pathogenic and variants that are less than 51 base pairs. We also include a little informational text here, remind you that you have some filters set. We keep these filters set until you turn them off, just in case you have found a set of filters that are going to be useful for multiple queries in a row. In the table, each row is a variant record that meets your search criteria. We tell you a description of the variant, the genes that it affects, the protein change if that's appropriate, the conditions that have been reported for the variant, the aggregate clinical significance and review status. We'll talk more about each of these fields. And then the accession number. You can see each of these is the VCV accession number, so you know that this is the variant record for each of these variants. And so for today's talk, we're going to look at this last variant in the screen. It's a single nucleotide variant right. So before we look at this page in detail, I want to kind of orient you to the organization of the page. At this point, you know a good bit about the difference between submitted data in ClinVar and aggregate data. So it may make sense to you that we've organized the page so that the aggregate data is in this top section, and then in the middle of the page is the section that focuses on the submitted data, followed by citations. So that's how we'll go through the page today. So let's start at the top of the page in the aggregate section. So the dark blue bar has the title of the page with a description of the variant, which is followed by the aggregate interpretation. So this aggregate interpretation is calculated by ClinVar, but based on submitted interpretations. We'll talk a little bit more about how that works. That's followed by the review status, or the stars. And the review status really indicates the level of review that supports the submitted interpretations and therefore the aggregate interpretation. We'll also talk a little bit more about how we calculate review status. One more field I'll point out in this section is the VCV accession number that we talked about earlier, along with its version number. So let's talk a bit about the ClinVar review status. So as I said, this gives you an idea of the level of review that has gone into the interpretation of this variant. And we calculate the review status based on 3 major things. So the first is whether that variant has been subject to expert review. And that could mean that the variant was reviewed in a practice guideline or that it was reviewed by an expert panel. So these expert panels are all approved by ClinGen. Many are actually organized by ClinGen, but they are all approved by a process that ClinGen has established. If the variant was not subject to expert review, we then look at 2 other things. So we look to see if there's consensus in the interpretation across multiple submitters. And we look to see if there's transparency into the rules that our submitters used for the interpretation. And we call the documentation of those rules their assertion criteria. So if we have both transparency into their classification rules and consensus in the interpretation, those records get 2 stars. If we have transparency into their classification rules, but we don't have consensus, either because there's disagreement in the interpretation or because there's just a single record, those records get 1 star. If we do not have transparency into their classification rules at all, those records get 0 stars. This is really a summary of the review statuses, not the actual review statuses themselves. They're all documented in more detail on our website, linked here. And one last thing I will leave with you about review status is that although it does give you an idea of how trustworthy the record is, what level of review has gone into it, it does not necessarily equate with right or wrong. Just because a record has 1 star or 0 stars does not mean the interpretation is wrong. It just means that at this point, we don't have enough supporting information to bump up the review status. So next, let's talk about the aggregate interpretation. So you already know that each submitted record has the interpretation that comes from the submitter. ClinVar also calculates an aggregate interpretation for each VCV or variant record, and it's based on the interpretations that came from submissions. And that's an important thing to remember. There's no person at ClinVar who is making a determination of the aggregate interpretation. It is rule-based, and we do calculations to get that value. So the way we do that is we select the SCVs or submitted records to include in this calculation, and we do that based on review status, what we just talked about. So there's an order of precedence that we use. If there is a record from a practice guideline, we use that interpretation for the aggregate value. If not, and there is a record from an expert panel, we use that interpretation. If there's neither of those, we then look at submissions where the submitter provided their assertion criteria. And if we don't have any of those, we look at any other submission where the assertion criteria was not provided. So once we've established the set of SCVs to use for the calculation of the aggregate interpretation, we look at the interpretation on those records to say, do they agree or disagree on the pathogenicity of the variant? And this specifically refers to the ACMG terms for pathogenicity, the 5 values from benign to pathogenic. And examples of aggregate terms that you could get at this point are pathogenic. So this could be based on a single record, or it could be that all records agree that the variant is pathogenic. In the case that some records called the variant pathogenic and others called it likely pathogenic, we report this combination term. We don't consider this to be a conflict, and we do the same thing for benign and likely benign. If there's any other conflict, so pathogenic versus benign or uncertain versus either pathogenic or benign, we call that a conflict. And the aggregate interpretation would be conflicting interpretations of pathogenicity. And then we also provide information about what those conflicting interpretations are. So ClinVar also has other terms for interpretation other than the ACMG terms. So then there's a final step to ask, are there non-ACMG interpretations for this variant as well? And if there are, we just list those out. These are also not considered conflicts. So for example, a variant may be reported as pathogenic and also being involved in a drug response, or a variant may be interpreted as both pathogenic and likely pathogenic for some diseases, but also determined to be a risk factor. So more information about how we calculate ClinSig and how it can be submitted to us is available online at this link. So that is the aggregate section at the top in this blue box, and that's followed by 3 tabs of summary data. And the variant detail tab is what you see by default. So this variant details tab has general facts about the variant, including the type of variant, where it is in the genome, HDVS expressions, and links to related databases. If you click on the second tab down called Conditions, you get a summary of the conditions for which the variant has been interpreted in ClinVar. So each row here in the table represents one of the reported conditions with a summary of information for that variant and condition pair, and also has a link out to the RCV record. And as you remember, the RCV record represents the variant condition aggregation. If you click on the third tab called Genes, you get a summary of the genes that are affected by this variant. So most variants in ClinVar affect a single gene. Here's an example of a variant that it's in the LDLR gene, but there happens to be an overlapping gene, an antisense gene here. So we give you that information as well. When you're looking at, say, a large copy number variant that spans multiple genes, you'll get a longer table here that lists out all of the genes affected. And so for each gene, we give you links out to the NCBI gene database, OMIM, and we also provide some information about ClinGen's dosage sensitivity curation. So that was the top section of the page, the aggregate section that we've looked at. And next we're going to move down the page to the section that focuses on submitted data. So the major focus of this section of the page is this table titled Submitted Interpretations and Evidence. So each row in the table represents a submitted record. You can see in each row the SCV accession number that was assigned to that record by ClinVar. And you can also see that there is a review status that is calculated by ClinVar for each record. Otherwise, all of the data that you see in these tables is represented as it came from the submission. So you can see the submitter's own interpretation of the variant, their assertion criteria, the condition that they interpreted the variant for, along with any citations or comments that they provided about their interpretation. And you can find more details about the submission by clicking out the link for evidence details. And then if you continue scrolling down the page, you get to the final section, which is focused on citations. Many users come to ClinVar to start their literature search about a variant. So we help with that by summarizing all of the citations that have been reported to us for a variant in this table called Citations for this variant. Now, this table may include a small number of citations that were curated by NCBI staff, but we are not really doing any level of comprehensive literature review. So by and large, this table includes citations that came to us in submissions. So because of that, we're also supplementing the citations you find in ClinVar with links to LitVar. LitVar is another NCBI product. If you're not familiar with it, I've included a link here so you can learn more about it. But LitVar does text mining of the information in PubMed and PubMed Central to find papers about variants. So we've included a link out when that's available so that you can supplement the citations that we have from ClinVar submissions with those that have been text mined. So before we move away from the web page, I want to go over 3 quick features that can help with communication between you and ClinVar. So the first is the follow button. This is available on every variant page. And when you follow a variant, it means that we will alert you when the aggregate interpretation of the variant changes. So for example, here, if this variant changes away from pathogenic, likely pathogenic, say to a conflict or to uncertain significance, you would get an email notification so that you could know maybe to come and reevaluate the evidence. Maybe you'd want to reclassify the variant yourself or possibly recontact the patient. More information about how to use the follow button is available on our website. Secondly, we encourage you to send us your feedback. You may have noticed in a lot of my screenshots this green feedback button. If you click on that, it takes you to a quick survey which asks you some questions about your experience using ClinVar and lets you give us information about what has worked well for you, what has not worked well. We do review all of the feedback that we get through this button, so we do encourage you to let us know how ClinVar is working for you. And then finally, you can always ask us for help. At the bottom of every ClinVar page is this footer, including a link over here on the right that says Support Center. That takes you to a page that has some help information on it, but it also just includes a way for you to email us and ask a question. And there's always someone on call who's responsible for addressing those emails. So we're happy to take your questions. So finally, let's shift gears and talk about how you can participate in ClinVar by sharing your own data. So who submits to ClinVar? Most of the data in ClinVar has come to us from clinical genetics testing labs, but we also have a lot of data from research labs, locus-specific databases, clinical providers like medical geneticists and genetic counselors. ClinGen has been working with patient registries to help get their data registered in ClinVar. We pull in data from OMIM and gene reviews, and we also work with ClinGen to get submissions from expert panels and practice guidelines. We have a page on our website, the link is shown here at the bottom, where we show everybody who submits to ClinVar along with some summary information about their data. So of course, if your organization starts submitting to ClinVar, you will also receive attribution here as well. So the first step to submitting is to register your organization to submit to ClinVar. So you log in to ClinVar submission portal. The link is shown here at the bottom of the page, and using your NCBI account. If you don't have an NCBI account yet, don't worry, it's quick and easy to set that up. Once you're logged in, you provide information about your organization in the submission portal. So you tell us about your organization, the people who are associated with it. That comes to the ClinVar team, where one of the curators will review your information, possibly get some corrections, and once it's approved, you're ready to submit data to ClinVar. So what data can be submitted? So I think at this point, you're probably very familiar with ClinVar's focus on variants that were interpreted for clinical significance for disease or evaluated for functional significance. We haven't really talked about this today, but if you are developing a functional assay for variants and would like to submit that data to ClinVar, contact us and we can talk about that with you. There are a few categories of data that we are not asking you to submit to ClinVar. Large numbers of variants from GWAS studies are not really in scope. That's probably more appropriate for dbGaP. Variants that were observed but not interpreted for their clinical significance are probably more appropriate for dbSNP or dbVar. And variants that were only evaluated by computational methods are also not in scope for ClinVar. If you use a computational method as part of a more comprehensive review, that's in scope, but we are not asking for variants that were only evaluated in silico. So when you have your variants that were interpreted for clinical significance and you're ready to submit, the minimal fields that we ask for in a submission are a description of the variant, the condition that you interpreted the variant for, the clinical significance or interpretation of that variant for the condition. And then for the evidence, the minimal fields that we ask for are how did you observe the variant? What's the allele origin? So for example, did you observe it in the germline or somatic tissue? In the individuals in whom you observed this variant, were they affected with the condition that you interpreted the variant for? So you can tell us yes, no, or you don't know. And then finally, how did you collect the data for this interpretation? Two of the most common methods here are clinical testing or research, but there are some other options as well. So there are many other optional fields that you can include in your submission as well. Some of the most frequently submitted and most useful fields are listed here, but there's many others too. So there are two major formats for submission. Most of the data in ClinVar comes to us through a batch submission using a file. This is good if you have more than a handful of variants to submit, and it's also good for repeat submitters. We have two Excel templates for submitters to use, and they're available on the FTP site. One of them is called the full template. It really handles any kind of submission to ClinVar. All variant types, many kinds of data types for the evidence are available in that spreadsheet. The light spreadsheet is a bit smaller and easier to manage, but it's limited. So you can only describe your variants with HDVS on this template, and there are fewer options for submitting your evidence. So an example of part of the light spreadsheet is shown here. As you can see, there are some instructions here and more instructions available online. So there is a bit of a learning curve to use the Excel spreadsheets. So if you only have a small number of variants to submit, or you think you're going to be an infrequent submitter, it may be better for you to use our single submission wizard. So this is an online wizard right in Submission Portal, and it takes you through a series of tabs and has you just fill in the data for each record that you want to submit to ClinVar. This takes a bit longer because it's record by record, but if you only have a small amount of data to submit, this might work out better for you. So what can you expect after you've submitted data? Some of your data is validated immediately in the submission portal. And for file submissions, you have a couple of options for how you want to handle any errors that we might find. So you can choose for us to just stop and return those errors to you for you to fix immediately. Or you can choose for us to accept any records that pass this round of validation, and we'll just report back any errors to you, and you can fix them in a later submission. This second option is most useful for groups who submit large volumes of data and who submit with some regularity, because it means that any good records can go through quickly and they're not held up by the records that have problems, which can just be submitted in your next round of data. This first option is particularly useful for those who have small data sets, especially if you're going to publish that set and you'd like it to be processed all together in ClinVar. So after you pass this first round of validation in Submission Portal, a ClinVar curator picks up your submission. He or she reviews and processes your submitted data. At this point, they may come up with a few more errors or questions where we need to clarify your data. And at that point, the curator will contact you to get corrections or clarifications. And once we get all that worked out, we load your data to our production server and we publish it on our website in our FTP files, and it's available by utilities. You also get a summary file with information about your successful submission, so then you have a summary of everything of what you have submitted to ClinVar and the SCV accession numbers that we assign to each of your records. So those SCV accession numbers are important for whenever you're going to update your data in ClinVar, and we do encourage you to keep your data up to date. And partially this is important because of ownership. So any data that your organization submits to ClinVar continues to be owned by your organization. You are not giving it to ClinVar. We are not going to update your data for you without your permission. And other ClinVar users cannot request, cannot make an update to your data. Your submissions can only be updated by your organization. So we do encourage you to update your data as needed. You can update your submitted records at any time after they're published. Updates are typically made to update the classification or the evidence, or even as I mentioned earlier, if you made a very minimal submission initially, you might want to add more information over time as that becomes easier for you. You can make updates to your records in a file submission, like we talked about earlier. In that case, you include the SCV accession number, and there's a column in the spreadsheet to indicate that this is an update. Or if you only have one or a couple of records to update, we also have a single SCV update form in the submission portal that lets you update a single record at a time. This is a limited form. There's only about 8 or so fields that can be updated, but these are the fields that are most frequently needed for the update, so it works pretty well. We also provide a couple of files on the FTP site that might help you in monitoring your submissions and determining what needs to be updated. I mentioned earlier, one of our tabbed limited files is this submission summary that you can use to parse out the rows that are relevant for your submitted records. We also provide a tabbed limited file with a summary of conflicting interpretations. You can also parse this out to find variants where you are in conflict with another submitter. These are records that you might want to re-review, possibly reclassify, and if you do, we'd love to get that updated in ClinVar. So finally, I want to thank all of you for your attention. Big thanks to the ClinVar team. This is our team of developers on the left, our team of curators, and our leadership within the NCBI and the NLM. Our contact information is here at the bottom. If you ever have questions, comments, or suggestions for us, we'd be happy to hear from you. You can contact me directly, or you can contact the ClinVar team at ClinVar@NCBI. As I mentioned earlier, we always have someone on call who takes our user mail, and we are happy to hear any of your feedback that you might have for us. So thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.